Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullens, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.
And thank you all for putting the trust in me and thinking that I can help you sort out St. George. I'm afraid I might be a terrible disappointment. I'm not going to be able to tell you how to vote. I'm not going to be able to tell you what to do, and I have been forewarned by my office not to stray into opinion territory at great risk to the future of my career. So, if you're looking for the short answer, you're not going to get it. Spoiler alert, you can leave now. But I will do the best I can to try to sort through some of this and maybe just take a little deeper dive. I know you read the newspaper, you read the business report, you've watched TV on it, and you've certainly seen the flyers that have probably been bombarding your mailboxes lately, depending on where you live. And it's hard to keep track of it all. And so I do have a little bit of information that maybe can help you get your head around it. I hope so. Before I do that, though, I want to thank Jim especially for mentioning the food column that I do with my sister. And I really do like none of it, like maybe 1% to her 99%. And she didn't stand up when they invited the guests. So I'm taking speaker's privilege to welcome Tracy Cook here, who really is a phenomenal culinary talent and under-recognized here in Baton Rouge. But anyway, so I think we were originally going to call this Just the Facts. And of course, facts are a funny thing today, right? And people don't even agree on facts as facts. And then I didn't want to get in trouble for saying something as a fact and be challenged on it. So I thought I would just change the title of the speech to Questions and Answers, because there are a lot of questions. And as Jim mentioned, we don't really have a lot of answers. And I think at this point, in an election with an issue of this magnitude for the future of Baton Rouge, we should have more answers than we do. So let's take a look. This is the map of St. George. Y'all have seen it before. It would be a population of roughly 86,000, as Jim mentioned, the fifth largest city in Louisiana between Lafayette and Lake Charles. And when you compare that to the city of Baton Rouge, we're 225,000. The parish of East Baton Rouge is a little more than 446,000. So roughly about 19%. And you can see, let's see, where's my little pointer, right? So around the red is the original city of St. George that was proposed back in 2015. You can see they tightened it up considerably. They cut out some of the parts that were either annexed by the city after the first unsuccessful effort, or where they thought they might not have a lot of success. So this area of St. George is a strong demographic for it. This map does not show something that's sort of interesting. There's a little bitty finger that goes up there that would actually be in St. George if it passes, and it would abut Central directly, the city of Central. And that was sort of, I wouldn't say that was hidden, but that was sort of obscured. But St. George organizers say that it gives them options in the future if they want to partner with Central for certain city services. So the election is October 12th, as you are all aware, and we don't know how that's going to turn out. Only voters in the footprint of St. George will be able to vote. You may remember the legislature earlier this year essentially thwarted an effort that would have allowed the whole parish to vote. So of the people that will be voting, there are a lot of supporters. And strictly, venturing into opinion territory here, I think there's sort of like three camps of people, okay? There are the diehards that are going to vote for this regardless of what information they know of what the facts are, or of whether the fact that their taxes are going to go up, because they really have come to see the city of Baton Rouge and the administration and the administrations that preceded it as a pejorative for everything that's wrong with the world. And they will just scream Council on Aging tax anytime you say something about Baton Rouge. So I think those people, regardless of what the numbers ultimately show, and even if their taxes are to go up under a St. George, will happily support it. And then there are the people that sympathize with the families in St. George that want better public schools to send their kids to. But they are sort of the opinion that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And so I think ultimately, even though they can sympathize, they're going to vote against it. There are a lot of people on the fence, as an article in The Advocate pointed out this morning, and those undecided voters are really going to make a difference. I was talking to a very prominent business person who I won't name, but y'all all know him, the other day, and I said, what do you think? Have you done any polling? He has not, and neither side has shared their polling numbers if they exist. But he said, he said, I think it's going to be close. And he said, I got to tell you, if I wake up that Sunday morning and I see that St. George passed, I'm going to be a little nervous. He said, I'm going to be a little rattled. But he said, if I wake up and I see that it hadn't passed, I'm going to be a little disappointed. And I don't know what we're going to do. So there is really that tension. And I think a lot of people haven't sorted that out. That's anecdotal evidence, anecdotal experience, but I think it's probably telling. But let's say for the sake of argument that it does pass, and you wake up on Sunday the 13th and we have a new city of St. George. For starters, nothing is going to change right away, and there are going to be some immediate legal challenges. Those challenges are already in the works. The lawsuits are ready to go, and they're going to be based on Louisiana Revised Statute 33.4. Section B says that you can challenge an incorporation because it might adversely affect the person or governmental entity that is filing the suit. And the plaintiffs will argue that St. George will adversely affect the city of Baton Rouge because of the decreased revenues. And then Section D is the other section of the law they're going to challenge. The court shall also reach a determination as to whether the municipality can in all probability provide the proposed public services within a reasonable period of time, and whether the incorporation is reasonable. And reasonable is the key word that they will use, that the lawsuit will hinge on, because they're going to argue that what St. George is proposing to do with the budget it has proposed is not reasonable, that it's just simply not feasible. And then as to whether or not the city can go about getting set up while these legal challenges are making their way through the courts, that's something that will likely be litigated as well, and I can't answer that for sure. But let's go back again and let's assume that this does eventually move forward. What happens first? So as outlined in the state law, the governor will appoint an interim administration consisting of a mayor, a city council, and a police chief, all right? The city by law does not have to have its own police department, but it does have to have its own police chief, and it does have to legally provide police services to its citizens, which legally has to be done either by the creation of a municipal police department or by contracting out with somebody like the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office. The interim administration will begin to draft ordinances, and it's unclear how far they'll be able to get because there's going to be so much uncertainty with Baton Rouge. And then there will eventually have to be a special election to rededicate the 2-cent sales tax to the city of St. George, assuming it isn't tied up in litigation. And then at the first regular election, the people of St. George can elect their own mayor, their own police chief, and their own city council. And even if legal challenges are underway, the St. George folks have said they would move forward because they have so much work to do and there are so many things to sort through. But I think one thing that's important to bear in mind is that unlike Central, which Baton Rouge willingly let go and willingly cooperated and negotiated with throughout, they're not going to be, not to speak for the mayor's administration at all, but I think there's going to be a lot more resistance and a lot more unwillingness to sit down and say, okay, well, let's just figure this all out and see what's going to happen. I think it's going to be much more of a contentious transition. And the real issue, of course, here, and what you probably want me to make most sense of for you, and I don't know how I'll be able to do that, but I'll try, is to really look at the numbers, right? So last March of 2018 now, St. George issued their new budget, $58 million budget funded by more than $53 million in sales tax revenues. Their expenses, they're projecting at $34 million, leaving them with a big fat surplus of $20 million. And they say they can do this because they're going to be more efficient, they're going to run their city like a business, and they're going to privatize services. Now, they can do this in theory if the city parish continues to provide certain services for the taxes that people in the St. George area are already paying, and if their law enforcement costs remain effectively the same, which the city parish says there's no way they can. We'll talk about law enforcement in a minute, but shortly after that budget came out, LSU's economists Lawrence and Richardson did a study saying, based on city parish finance department data, that St. George's estimates were off. Their study showed that revenues would only equal about $45.8 million, so more than $12 million less than St. George projected. They say expenditures would be $51 million, more than $17 million more than the St. George folks have projected. And Richardson again said his estimates were based on data provided by the city parish finance department and would include what St. George would have to pay for public works, drainage, the city parish pension costs, we'll talk about that, and again, the money for law enforcement. The St. George people countered by saying, this analysis would have some merit if we ran St. George like Baton Rouge is run. We're not, and that's the entire point. So, I wish I could tell you who's right for sure, and I suspect neither is entirely correct. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle, but, this explains kind of why it's hard to say how this will all work. Because, for instance, St. George says, look, if we're gone, the city of Baton Rouge expenses are going to go down by 20% since we represent roughly 20% of the city parish. So, like, DPW costs are going to drop by 20%. The city says that's not necessarily the case because everything is just too bundled together, and you literally cannot just subtract 20% from DPW's budget because it's no longer providing services to 20% of the people who live in the parish. There's a lot of cost sharing that goes on in government. There are utilities costs that come from buildings and grounds, and I'm not saying it can't ever be split up, but it can't necessarily be split up that simply. So there are just questions that we don't really know the answer to. And the law enforcement is an example of why it is so confusing. So St. George organizers have said, look, the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office will continue to provide police protection for us just like they do now. And it sounds simple, right? But it's not. So think about it. The East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's budget, okay, is $90 million. And $60 million or so of that is funded by a parish-wide millage that we all pay, not just people in St. George, but Baton Rouge, Zachary, Central, the whole thing, right? Not Central, Baker. But parish-wide operations, it funds not just patrols in unincorporated East Baton Rouge Parish, but everything in the whole system, infrastructure and equipment, the property tax division, court system services, the jail, right? So St. George area alone generates about $13.6 million of those property taxes. Again, that's roughly 20%. But here's the thing, Baker, Zachary, and the city of Baton Rouge also pay millions of dollars a year in additional property tax. Besides the property taxes we pay to support the sheriff, we pay our own property taxes to support the City of Baton Rouge Police Department, the City of Baker Police Department, and the City of Zachary Police Department. So a key question that some opponents have raised is, why should St. George be entitled to use the services of the sheriff's office as its municipal law enforcement agency and only have to pay once when everybody else in the parish is effectively paying twice? It gets to be an equity issue. St. George organizers have acknowledged that they will have to pay more than just the $13.6 million that their property taxes generate to go towards the sheriff department's budget. And so in that proposed $58 million operating budget that we saw from March of 2018, they're projecting an additional $4 million in sales tax revenues that they say will go towards their law enforcement, okay? And it says, for additional police protection, quote, to be negotiated with the sheriff. So that would give them a total law enforcement budget of roughly $17.6 million. But the question is that really enough? And that's a key question that we haven't gotten an answer to, that we should get an answer to before we vote on something like this. Just to give you an example of how other Louisiana cities stack up when you look at what their law enforcement costs, the city of Lake Charles, which has a population of 75,000 compared to the 86,000 or so of St. George, they spend over $20 million on law enforcement. The city of Alexandria, which at 43,000 people is only about half the size of St. George, spends $15.2 million, which is about 80% of what St. George has said it would cost them. So you can see that the numbers certainly are low when compared to what law enforcement costs in other parts of the state. And if you look at it a different way, the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office last year, by its own website data, responded to 86,000 calls for service. 26,000 of them came from the Klein-Peter substation, which is the main substation in St. George. So that's about a third, right? They have a $90 million budget. A third of $90 million is $30 million. So it would seem to be more in line. I mean, it would seem to suggest that the St. George budget more realistically would be closer to $30 million than $17.6 million. But even if it's somewhere in the middle, let's say it's $24 million, let's say it's $25 million, that's not what they're saying, and that's not what they're putting forth in their budget. And why not? That's a question that's worth answering. Now I know there are people that will say, again, we'll gladly pay higher taxes just to be away from under the thumb of City Hall. But then why doesn't the proposed budget reflect that? And part of the issue is, St. George has said it wants to do what the city of Central has done, and it's worked out so well for Central, and the sheriff's office has provided law enforcement to Central. But the thing is, Central has essentially gotten, I wouldn't say a free ride, but they've gotten heavily subsidized law enforcement protection under what amounts to a sweetheart deal from the sheriff's office, and it dates back to an agreement, a 5-year agreement, between Central and then Sheriff Elmer Litchfield. And he agreed when Central broke off that deputies assigned to Central already would continue providing the services, just as they were doing at the time. And when Sheriff Gautreaux took office, he continued to honor the deal, which at the time had 2 years left. And he has continued to honor it ever since. But, here's the catch. Additional patrols in Central are provided by off-duty East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's deputies, and they're treated as 1099 contract employees. So they're getting paid directly for their overtime, right? But the department as a whole isn't getting compensated for the services. So what about the ancillary costs of law enforcement, right? The wear and tear on their patrol cars, the gas, the weapons, all of the hidden costs of police protection are being subsidized by taxpayers everywhere else in the parish, not in Central. And Sheriff Gautreaux told me here a few weeks ago, we sat in the back room and did an interview, that Central has been getting a good deal from him, and that these are the kind of things that are going to have to be revisited or rethought out if a St. George was to become a reality, because there is an equity argument, to be made there. There are other questions, too, about things, for instance, like sewer and sanitation. St. George has said through the continuation of services provided by the Consolidated Garbage Service District, they will take care of sewer and sanitation. All right, but technically there is no Consolidated Garbage Services District in the city parish right now. Rather, the city parish provides the service for a fee of $23 per household. Now, will residents of the new St. George want to pay that fee? Will the parish be willing to provide it? How much would it cost? Would it still be $23, or could St. George privatize it for less? I'm not saying they couldn't, but it's another example of the type of data that we still don't have yet. So, and then there are all of the other services. I'm not sure what they're going to do with EMS and 911. Originally, that was a big question mark. But St. George may provide all other municipal services, they have said in their own documents, including planning and zoning. Think about that, whole new planning department. Building inspections, traffic signs and signals, maintenance and improvement of municipal streets, maintenance of right-of-way, maintenance to the drainage system, and regulation of alcoholic beverages and animal control. And there's been some question about whether the use of the word may, which is in quotes, means that the new city definitely will provide those services, or just that it might if it can afford to. Now, St. George organizers have come back and said, no, we definitely will, and we are intending to do most of it by contracting out to private providers. But it's not really clear how that will work, and that could prove particularly tricky with respect to things like streets. You know, what's a parish street versus a St. George street, and how would the responsibility divide up? Legacy costs is another big question. The city of St. George has budgeted $4 million to pay for legacy pension costs for municipal employees, which they say represents their share of the costs. The city parish has said it would be at least $7 million by their calculation. I mean, again, for the sake of argument, let's just split the difference and say it's somewhere in the middle. But we don't really know. And last week, the Metro Council was going to vote on this. Barbara, what happened there?
It was deferred.
No, I know they deferred. They deferred for a month, conveniently. So we don't know what's ultimately going to happen with that. We're not blaming.
That was not necessarily just the St. George people who wanted to do that. Was
everybody. But a big issue, that's to be determined, but a big issue is the school system. And of course, the whole impetus for St. George, originally at least, was for schools, right? So what happens with the schools? Well, creating a school district will require a 2/3 vote of the legislature. And so I'm saying it's not coming to a neighborhood near you anytime, because this is going to take several years to work out. I mean, it took 2 years in Central. So I think it's safe to say it would be more than that here in St. George, at the least. So if you have a kid in school, maybe by the time they're graduating, you know, you might see a St. George school district. But if and when they sort out all these other problems and they're able to move forward, it's going to require a 2/3 vote of the legislature. Obviously, it's going to have to fight several legal challenges. And then there are several issues why, all right? There are capacity issues right off the bat. Let me get my notes here and see, right? So the opponents of St. George say there just aren't enough schools currently to accommodate the students, something like 1,084 students. The St. George folks say that they could address this through the use of temporary buildings, all right? There are the legacy costs for the employees and the teachers of the school system. St. George has said that other school districts don't pay legacy costs like Zachary, Central, and Baker, but the parish school officials here in East Baton Rouge have argued that any new school districts should share in costs. There are taxes and funding questions that haven't been answered. St. George is adamant that taxes would not have to go up to build new schools. And they have suggested that charter schools would be able to come in and build these new schools. That wasn't the experience in Central and Zachary, whose property taxes went way up. I mean, that's just a fact. I can't tell you what would happen in St. George, but I can tell you that it's not what happened in Central and Zachary. And then even assuming once they got all that worked out, there would be issues about where students would go. There are nearly 2,000 students in the Magnet and Gifted School program who live in the proposed city of St. George. Would they be able to continue going to Baton Rouge High or Lehigh High or Glasgow Middle? There are 1,374 students who attend school in the district at St. George Schools but don't live there. So would they have to leave? So altogether, you're talking about more than 3,000 students who would be displaced. So, you know, what it could mean to Baton Rouge, the numbers on my pie chart, I'm not telling you they're off. I'm just saying they don't add up to 100. So it really should be a lopsided pie chart there. But it was to illustrate a point. The city parish has said it would be very hamstrung by the lost revenues. And St. George organizers have accused the administration and the opponents of St. George of fear tactics and have said this simply isn't true. But, you know, according to the Richardson and Lorenz study that I cited a few minutes ago, revenues to the city parish would be diminished by some $45 million, okay? So if you look at the whole city parish budget and what they have to work with there, that's $322 million. But if you take out the law enforcement costs, you're left with just $145 million to play with, or so, 148 I think it is. So if 45 million of that goes away, that's a third of the city parish budget. That's a huge chunk of money that Baton Rouge is going to lose. But beyond that, beyond the financial costs, what it could mean to Baton Rouge is really the breakup of the consolidated form of government that we have had here for some 70 years. You know, because if you have now 5 independent cities in the parish, there would really be no point to have a consolidated form of government anymore. And so with the loss of that, you lose the collective buying power. You know, I mean, I know everybody's into tribalism and doing their own thing today, but from an economic perspective, it just really doesn't make more sense. It just doesn't. And there's the loss of budgeting discretion. People forget that the point of a city parish government, right, is consolidated resources. So a metro council, when it's working like it should, right, is able to allocate the resources to the projects and programs that most need it, not just what is in the one specific area where the revenues came from. And sort of ironically, a lot of St. George got built because our consolidated form of government, you know, allocated parish-wide revenues that were collected from throughout the parish to build roads out in that area, you know. So that, because that's where the growth was and that's where the need was. But if you lose the consolidated form of government, you lose that. Another thing I think is important to look at is the Central experience, because, you know, the St. George supporters have said that Central is really what they want to model this after. And Central certainly has been something of a success story. It's grown from roughly 20,000 people at the time of incorporation to more than 29,000 today. There were 13 years of surplus. They created great public schools, 30% population growth. And then, as you may remember, if you were paying attention last fall, voters ousted the mayor, they ousted the police chief, and they voted out 4 council members. So how can this perfect place be so great if they're throwing everybody out? And I mean, I would tell you that the short answer is, you know, government is just not easy. It is just not that simple. And as attractive as it sounds to run government like a business, they have very different missions and very different needs, and people in Central got frustrated because they saw their taxes going up. And why did government have to raise their taxes? Well, in part because the area was growing and they needed a new city hall, or they wanted a new city hall, and all of a sudden it wasn't all wine and roses in Central. And we asked Junior Shelton a few months ago, like, you know, what's your takeaway? What did y'all do wrong? And what advice would you give to the people in St. George? And he said, be very careful moving forward in what you say, because people will remember. Don't say you're going to do this and won't raise taxes, because eventually you might. Another really interesting example, and this has been the other sort of poster child for incorporations, is the little hamlet of Sandy Springs, which is in Fulton County, Georgia. It's an exurb of Atlanta. They incorporated in 2005 and did everything right. They privatized just about everything. They had a very small handful of employees, and St. George supporters have looked to Sandy Springs as an example of what they want to do. Now, just this past May, like 3 months ago, the city council there hired back 183 of their contract employees versus renewing the $21 million contract. They said by making them municipal employees, they would save $2.7 million a year, or $14 million over 5 years. Seriously. So, and again, from what I read, and again, this came from the Atlanta Constitution Journal, so that was the source on the information, but the officials in Sandy Springs were quoted as saying, look, this doesn't mean we're giving up on privatization or that privatization didn't work, but it doesn't always work, and it's not working right now for what we need. We will revisit it. We will continue to work it into the mix. My point is just that it's not that simple. So there's a lot to think about, and a lot of experiences that aren't quite maybe what you've heard. But I wanted to save a few minutes for questions, because Davis Rohr wanted me to save a few minutes for questions. You can't ask me anything that's going to trip me up. But if you have anything. Yes.
In the $58 million budget, how much of it is budgeted for legal costs to fight the legislation that they're going to have to fight?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And off the top of my head, I don't know. I should have brought a copy of the budget with me. I knew somebody would ask me about the breakdown. I don't remember seeing a legal cost in their expense column. If there might be, but I'll check on that and I'll email you when I get back to the office, because I really do have it and I forgot to bring it. Ben?
If Central's getting, in your words, a sweetheart deal, does that mean the taxpayers of Baton Rouge are not getting a sweetheart deal?
It just means that the taxpayers of Baton Rouge, you're talking about the city of Baton Rouge, we're paying twice for law enforcement, and they're basically only having to pay for it once.
How is that legal?
Well, that's a question for another day. That gets into the trip me up category. Yes.
So I'm trying to determine, is the argument that to incorporate St. George, they can do the same thing cheaper, or is it that we can pay the same amount and get a much better service? I'm still trying to understand what the impetus is.
The word they use is efficient, It's efficient, so that would mean we can get more for less, right? Our dollar will go further and we'll get better services at the same time. So I suppose both. It's interesting because the argument for St. George really sort of shifted. In the original effort 4 years ago, it was all about the schools. And this time around, it's been much more focused on efficiency of city services. I mean, the schools are still part of it, but they sort of have shifted the focus to really city government just hadn't done right by us, and we can do it better.
If it
Right.
passes, money aside, how does it change the identity of that which remains as what we call Baton Rouge?
I think that's a great question. I really, really do.
If it passes, money aside, how does it change the identity of what we call Baton Rouge?
Yeah.
What does Baton Rouge become?
And they've said, look, nothing's really going to change about us. We're just those of us that live in the St. George area are going to get our city services from different providers. But we're still one big parish, one big happy parish, defined by the state capitol and Exxon and the LSU Tigers. But we won't really be one consolidated government. And what it means for our economic competitiveness is, I think, a whole nother question. And it's interesting that we haven't seen a lot of leadership from the business community on that aspect of it at all. Davis?
Actually, to answer Fred's question, it changes it dramatically because, and this is more of a statement on this, but when the city is basically calling for a 20% reduction in everybody's budget, which they are, and I know Darrell is here to listen to this, we're not affected by it because we're a dedicated tax. We're affected by it.
We being the DDD, he
downtown
means.
development districts. But what it does do is for us change the character of it, though. If the city parish cannot provide funds for social service agencies, for the LASM, the USS Kid, and stuff, then they have to then cut back services. Then they can't provide basically a tourism economy or a visitors economy, which then affects people like Visit Baton Rouge and the hotels downtown to bring in business to the city. So the spillover effect, I think, is huge, whereas a consolidation is much more efficient.
Jim Brandt has a question.
Question. You mentioned the high hurdles that you mentioned.
Project, Jim.
You mentioned the high hurdles that St. George would have to overcome if they wanted to create their own school system, including the 2/3 vote of both houses of the legislature. Wouldn't they also have to require or pass a constitutional amendment on the state level to allow the creation of a school district in St. George?
I think so. I think that's a good point.
Vote
Yeah.
of the state.
A vote of the state.
It would have to pass statewide as well as locally.
Correct. Angela?
Stephanie, do you know how much I want to know how much the taxes went up in Central for the schools?
No, that's a good question. I wish I knew offhand. I can find that out too and email you.
Stephanie, got a question. You wrote an article or co-authored an article a couple years ago stating that Baton Rouge was one of the top 5 over-leveraged cities in the U.S. And over 50% of that was either pension, retirement costs, or the debt. Let's say St. George does not pass. How does Baton Rouge survive?
I will say this, that it has been widely reported that Baton Rouge city government is drowning in pension debt. The administration says that some of those calculations are not true. No, I mean, I'm not enough of an expert in it to be able to explain this clearly, but that those figures aren't entirely true, and that they have also taken some steps to start paying it down over the years, which is also true. So what I wrote 2 years ago, based on the data that was available then, and it depends on how those studies look at the data, I would not still stand by those numbers. I'm not saying that what I wrote at the time wasn't true, but I'm saying I don't think that data is relevant any longer.
Would you say you're still over-leveraged as a city?
Well, I can't say that without looking at the numbers right now, but we're over-leveraged as a state for sure. I know our pension debt is a huge problem, so I'm not going to say that it's not, you know. I think it's time to go, y'all.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Collins, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.